Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Nephilim VA bringing you the third chapter of our Painted Stages Fall Apart by Scenes, which is written by Silverheart SP on AO3. The last chapter ripped out my heart a little bit, and I'm anxious to find out what happens next. And with that, I have to inform you that this fanfiction is an emotional rollercoaster of a wump, so I'll prepare you in advance with the trigger warnings. This fanfiction is for general audiences with themes of fluff and angst, near-death experiences, and canon-typical violence. Also beware of slight manga spoilers. If that isn't your style, then I recommend a real James Bond type, which is written by Hybrid Empress on AO3. It can be found on my channel. Brace yourselves, everybody. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 3. Time stops for no one. Tsukauchi accompanied Toshinori to go and talk with Aizawa and Nezu. Toshinori was grateful. It would be a lot easier to talk about it with someone else as a buffer. It turns out they needn't have worried. Aizawa was already aware of the situation, and in fact had more information on it than was provided in the news report. All Might, good, you're here, he said gravely as Toshinori and Tsukauchi entered the foyer area of the dormitories. Aizawa, Midnight, Nezu, and Present Mike were already gathered there, looking serious. I suppose you've heard what's happened then, he asked, and Toshinori nodded. Both he and Tsukauchi took a seat. The others present all knew the officer, so weren't bothered by his presence. Only what was on the news report, he clarified. Aizawa nodded. Behind him, Midnight was sorting through some papers, and Mike was focused intently on a laptop screen. All right, it's fit to inform you then. This is an incident unrelated to the school. Our students were not targeted directly. It was just bad luck that they were caught in. Toshinori nodded slowly. It didn't really ease any of his immediate concerns, but he supposed it was good to know. At least the rest of his students were safe. Next to him, Tsukauchi pulled out a notepad and pen. Aizawa continued. There is already one particular villain group suspected, which is under investigation. It is also unaffiliated with the school or the League of Villains. It's a smaller group, comprised of mostly lesser-known criminals with non-combat-oriented quirks. Their main crimes often include property damage, but this is the first instance of it on this scale, or in such a public place. Toshinori nodded again, his mind switching into the familiar hero mode he was so used to. He pushed away his feelings. Right now, he wouldn't be able to help Izuku and the others by worrying. The UA faculty has been called upon to assist with the rescue effort, said Nezu, who had been silently sipping on some green tea, his usual smile, for once, not present. I apologize, Yagi, but I'm not sure it would be safe for you to help. Toshinori nodded slowly. Logically, he knew Nezu was right. He would be much more of a liability than a help, but it killed him. To sit back and wait. Tsukauchi, knowing how he was feeling, laid a hand on his shoulder in comfort. Don't worry, we'll keep you updated, said Aizawa, now adjusting his capture scarf. I know how worried you must be. Behind him, Midnight stood up, and Mike closed his laptop. Yes, please do. He could only sit and watch as the heroes left the room. He was helpless. After realizing exactly how screwed they were, Izuku felt considerably more awake through the consistent pain. Ignoring the pain best as he could, he had taken a few minutes to attempt some calculations to try to work out how much oxygen they had. Unfortunately for him, They hadn't covered anything like this in class yet. Izuku knew humans actually took in less oxygen than people often thought they did, but there was the size of the space to account for, and the fact that there were two of them, and Bakugo's explosions which caused some fire, which would eat up oxygen. Izuku also knew there was about 5 hours worth of oxygen in a coffin. Thankfully, their space was significantly bigger than that. They were more likely to pass out from carbon dioxide poisoning before they used it all up anyway. The bottom line was, they hopefully had hours. Probably more than 5, but he was injured. He couldn't help but take in deeper breaths, gasping ones, as pain shot through his veins. After Izuku had mentioned with difficulty that he thought they had more than 5 hours of air, they had lapsed into silence. Izuku was simultaneously too weak and in pain and too afraid to talk, while Bakugo simply preferred silence. Izuku thought that they had already been trapped for an hour or 2 at the very least, but he didn't trust his own judgment, with pain and exhaustion clouding his thought process. Bakugo had taken to trying to dig them out from the other side of the tunnel, occasionally coming back over to check that Izuku was still awake. The rhythmic scraping and grunting paired with the occasional distant rumble of thunder that filled up the space helped, but it was still an effort for him to not succumb to the depths of his mind. Bakugo had opted to use his explosions as little as possible, which meant most of the time they were engulfed in the thick, complete darkness. Izuku thought he would be used to it by now, but he simply wasn't. It was intense and terrifying. He could do nothing but lie in place, completely still. Even the smallest movement sent unbearable waves of pain crashing through his entire body, and the thought of passing out like that again frightened him. Helpless with the backdrop of Bakugo's digging and cursing, his mind began to drift. What had happened to his friends? Had they made it out? Were they trapped? Izuku thought he and Bakugo might have been a bit late in getting back, so maybe they were already together at the meeting point. Hopefully they had each other. It would be even more terrifying being stuck alone. He knew they had been on the first floor at least, so maybe they were faring better. Maybe they had gotten out by now. Surely rescue teams would have been deployed already. He thought it would have been long enough for that. If they were on the first floor, they must have been found faster. He felt himself begin to tear up as he thought about his friends. Yaoyorozu would probably be fine. She was a quick thinker, and would definitely be able to figure out something to create to give her the best advantage possible. If she was with the others, they would all be fine. Kirishima and Sato had high durability. Izuku knew that they would probably have been able to protect themselves from falling rubble, maybe even protect others. And Ida, though his quirk was less useful, he was no less quick-witted and resourceful. Thinking about them made him so scared. He wanted them to be okay. He needed them to be okay. Underneath the fear, at the back of his hazed mind, a dull sort of shame pulled at him. Thinking about his friends made him compare his own situation, and he felt his uselessness more than ever. He was a burden to Bakugo. He was sure Bakugo would have blasted himself out by now if not for the risk of the space collapsing in on itself and burying Izuku. He hated it. He hated being unable to help, being a liability. His face burned, and he felt wet tears roll down his cheeks. He was sure they were making a trail through the grime caked onto his face, and it must have looked absurd if there had been light. He let out a wet sniffle. "What the fuck are you crying about now?" rang out Bakugo's rough voice from the other end of the space. It sounded extra amplified after the extended silence. Izuku couldn't answer. He knew if he opened his mouth he would begin to sob, and he absolutely could not do that if they wanted to save oxygen. He heard movement in the darkness, and felt once again Bakugo's invisible presence lean over him. Thunder boomed from the outside. "You awake?" he asked. A rough hand harshly tapped his nose. Izuku thought he must have been going for his cheek, but he missed. Yeah, was all he could manage without breaking down. Tch, muttered Bakugo, withdrawing his hand. Fucking pathetic. Watch out, nerd. Izuku screwed his eyes shut, just in time as Bakugo let off a weak explosion. 2 more fat tears fell down his face at the motion as orange light once again filled the back of his eyelids. Bakugo cursed above him, this time loudly. Another light was flashed, but not more than that. Bakugo knew the importance of oxygen. Some shuffling. Izuku kept his eyes shut. It made it easier to bear the darkness. "Alright, Deku," said Bakugo, his voice sounding strangely neutral. "Your wound is bleeding. I have to rip my shirt to wrap it, okay?" Izuku swallowed. He made a whimper of affirmation. Bakugo's calloused hands slowly lowered down onto his torso, just avoiding the rebar. They were soft and light as they felt around. Softer than Izuku would have ever thought Bakugo could be. He was being incredibly careful to not jar the injury. Eventually, he reached the edge of Izuku's shirt closest to the wound, having managed to avoid it. Izuku could not be more grateful. Bakugo kept his hand there as the other one moved around behind him. There was a chalky noise. It sounded like Bakugo was using his free hand to sift through the destruction. Then he felt the hand on him press down in a gentle pressure. Even a pressure that light made Izuku want to scream. But he kept quiet, gritting his teeth. Bakugo used something, it must have been a bit of rubble, and there was a slight tearing noise as he used it to cut up his shirt. Izuku panted. Bakugo was being careful, but his whole body was incredibly sensitive right now. Even the smallest movement sent electrical lines of pain shooting through him, but he could bear it. It was the least he could do. There was more movement, the pressure on his side remaining light. He felt Bakugo lean in more heavily over him. "This is probably going to fucking suck," said Bakugo, his voice still neutral. More movement, then something soft was shoved under his chin. "Here, bite down on this," he said. A little higher up," stammered Izuku. Bakugo thankfully decided not to remark on this, instead moving the things upwards until it reached his mouth. Izuku figured it must be another part of Bakugo's shirt. What else was there in here that was safe to bite down on? It was stuffed into his mouth. Unable to stop himself, Izuku tensed up when he felt the hand leave. Any second now. There was no warning. Bakugo suddenly pressed down harder onto his torso, and he felt something touch his wound. Izuku screamed hoarsely into the shirt as searing pain exploded straight from the wound and stars popped in front of his vision. Bakugo tried to be gentle. Izuku knew he did, but there was no avoiding the agony involved with consistent pressure and touching a wound such as his. The stars in his eyes went fuzzy, and despite not being able to see, he felt a strong sense of inertia. Izuku choked on a gasp, the shirt muffling the sound. He had to scream hoarsely again when a sudden jolt of excruciating pain burst through him and the world exploded. "Eku!" This time, Bakugo was whispering loudly rather than shouting. Izuku couldn't help but be thankful for that as he let out a groan. His mouth felt fuzzy. Why was his groan muffled? He became acutely aware of a foul taste invading his mouth and the feeling of wet, disgusting fabric. Oh yeah, Bakugo must have accidentally moved his hand too harshly or something. That would be why he blacked out. The pain still throbbed in his side, worse than before, but still not unbearable. Izuku gave a strangled hum, unable to speak. There was silence, other than some slight shuffling. "Sorry," said Bakugo after a second. His voice was dull, not quite guilty, but not laced with anger like it usually was. "I accidentally hit the rebar and it moved. You blacked out, but I finished wrapping it. Sure enough, Izuku could feel the soft texture of Bakugo's shirt on his side, where before there had been stinging, dirty air. It was pulled tight around his wound, creating a steady, white-hot burning feeling. That was good. It meant there was pressure on it. It was already warm. He could feel it had been partially soaked in wet blood. Hopefully that would help stem the bleeding. Izuku turned his head to the side and spat out his own bit of shirt. He was impressed that Bakugo had only made one mistake, despite the voidish blackness they were stuck in. He sputtered for a moment, gulping in dusty air. He was too exhausted to be surprised that Bakugo had actually apologized and admitted the mistake, so he just didn't think about it. Thank you, Ka-chan, he whispered after a few seconds, his voice hoarse. His throat burned. He needed water. Bakugo only grunted. There was more movement and the presence at his side leaving to go back to try and dig them out. Don't pass out again, barked Bakugo once he had reached the other end. The sudden noise startled Izuku so much that he twitched slightly. Izuku could only imagine how cold Bakugo must be right now without a shirt. As if to remind himself of the weather, another deep boom of thunder rumbled in the distance. I won't, he tried, hoping it would be true. The crushing darkness pulled at him, the only sound being the crunch and scrape of rubble as Bakugo tried to move it. Shota had been grading essays in his office when he got the call. It was unlike Nezu to call his staff on a weekend, so Shota had obligingly put down his papers and picked up, the contact flashing brightly in the dim lighting of his office. "Hello?" he asked, mentally preparing himself for something. "Yes, Eraserhead," said Nezu, and that was Shota's first clue something was wrong. His hero name could only mean bad news. "I'm sorry for the phone call, but I know you don't check your emails often. There is a situation. The police and rescue services have requested the aid of UA Pro Hero faculty in a large-scale rescue operation. Can you meet me at the front of the school as soon as possible?" Shota suddenly felt much more alert. He quickly steeled himself, his hero resolve overtaking his regular work mindset immediately. "Of course," he said shortly, already sitting up and scanning his room for shoes. "Good," said Nezu before abruptly hanging up. Shota had put the phone down and was ready to leave within the minute. When he reached the front of the school, it was to a considerable group of Pro Hero staff standing in the rain that worked at UA. They all wore serious faces. This wasn't a matter of the school, this was hero work. Shota wasted no time in joining the edge of the group, next to Midnight. In another minute, Nezu appeared from the entrance, looking grave. The group of heroes all stood at attention as he made his way to the front to address them. "All right, heroes," he said, his voice firm and loud. "There has been a major villain attack at Musatafu Museum. An unidentified group has blown up a large portion of the building, specifically the Hero Exhibition, currently being hosted, causing major structural collapse and extensive property destruction. An estimated 200 civilians are currently trapped at the site. You all have been requested to aid with the rescue efforts. You are all expected at the site within an hour. Any questions?" Short, sharp, and to the point. Executed perfectly so as to waste as little time as possible while getting across all the information. Shota's blood ran cold. Musatafu Museum. Hero Exhibition. "You have to let us go, sir. It's a hero exhibition, and we're in the hero course, right?" His students. Shota raised his hand. Nezu nodded at him. "A group of 6 of my students were visiting the location, sir," he said, his voice and face blank with shock. In his peripheral, He saw Midnight turn to look at him in horror. His voice and delivery were as dry as always, but anyone who knew him well would be able to detect the undercurrent of fright. Nezu nodded at him. "Thank you for alerting me," he said blankly, professionally. "You and I and a few others will have to stay behind to fill out an incident report. Once that is finished, we will immediately rendezvous at the site." "Yes, sir," said Shota numbly. The next few minutes passed by quickly. Midnight and Present Mike were tasked to help with the incident report, and the rest of the group dispersed to go to the museum. Shota had the necessary paperwork in his office at the dormitories, so that's where they would go, since it was the closest. As he and the others walked briskly towards the entrance to the dormitories, the reality began to sink in. He, as a hero, had been on similar rescue operations before. He knew how often the people being rescued had severe injuries, the trauma they faced the longer they were stuck. Also, how often they lost their lives, be it from wounds or lack of food and water. And with this rain, there was a risk of pockets of space where people were stuck getting flooded. 6 of his students were at that museum. 6 of his students who could currently be in a number of situations. Were they in trouble? Were they trapped underneath the remains of the collapsed building? Were they injured? Shota's stomach roiled at the thought, remembering people he had rescued in the past from collapsed buildings. One woman had needed her leg amputated, and one man had needed multiple skin grafts. Another image flashed in his mind, 6 bodies strewn before him. He was too late. Shota quickly shook that off. He needed to focus. He logically knew his students would be doing everything possible to take care of themselves, but there were some injuries that were unavoidable in a building collapse. They must be terrified. He knew Kirishima had self-confidence issues. What if he was blaming himself for any injuries his friends had gotten? Bakugo could be reckless. What if he had tried to blast himself out and gotten crushed by debris? Ida and Yaoyorozu probably would feel responsible for their friends and want to take charge. If anything happened, they would blame themselves. Sato might feel like dead weight without sugar to fuel his quirk, and be beating himself up over it. His problem child had a nasty tendency to attract trouble and break his bones. Shota's heart was in his mouth as he thought of the possibility of the boy going after the villains alone and getting severely injured. Maybe they were safe. Maybe they had been evacuated. Shota swallowed. The best thing he could do to help his students right now was to fill out the reports and get to the museum as soon as possible. He wouldn't be able to help them if he was sick with worry. Shota became a racerhead. He shoved all personal feelings aside, deep down. He would deal with them later, when he knew for sure the status of his students. Right now, he needed to steel himself and fill out that report. The group of heroes were quick and efficient. As soon as they reached the foyer, Nezu conjured the necessary documents from Shota's office and they all got to work. Nezu quickly relayed some extra information to them, telling them not to worry about the school. Apparently the group they suspected was unaffiliated, and it had been chance that UA students were present at the attack. Other than that, they worked in silence, wanting to be on the field to help as soon as possible. Partway through their job, the door to the dormitories opened, and Shota looked up. It was All Might and one of his police officer friends. Now Amasa Sukauchi, if he remembered correctly. From the distraught look on the gaunt man's face, Shota knew he was already aware of what had happened. They exchanged some quick words. All Might had come to alert the school that a group of students had been caught up in a disaster. Apparently the situation had made it onto the news already, and that's where All Might had heard about it. Shota gave him some extra information, which Sukauchi noted down. Looking at how afraid All Might looked, Shota felt awful when Nezu told him he couldn't help. All Might was seated down heavily on a chair, his hands shaking and his eyes wide. His features seemed more gaunt and sunken than usual. "We'll give you an update as soon as possible," promised Shota, All Might looked up at him, his eyes filled with something desperate. They left as soon as they were able. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. This chapter hurt. Izuku's pain, All Might not being able to help, and Aizawa being so parental towards his students. I think I need a hug now. Also, at time of recording, our bouquet of flowers has grown to the bountiful number of 998. 1K is so close, and I am so thankful for you all. Would you be interested in a 1K special? If so, is there anything you'd be interested in it being? All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, Silverheart SP on AO3. I'd highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!